blank stares. And so I finally found a way to convey to people what I do, and I said, all right, you know, over in England, those boys who wear the funny white collars and sing in the churches? Oh, yeah, okay, that's what I do, basically. And those children in those choir schools, and there are, most of them are Anglican, but there are a few Catholic ones, and lest anyone think that that's an Anglican tradition that we can't implement, most of those choirs were around long before Henry VIII broke away from the church, and even though the Anglicans have definitely developed it, that really does come from a deeply Catholic culture. And I think that that's something that we really need to bring back to the education of our young people. Although, it's funny when I look at, you look at those old postcards from the 1950s, Christmas cards where they show the boys singing in choir, and they always have their red cassocks and white surplices on. And for some reason, I see many of those pictures where the boys are wearing these big black bows. Do you know what I'm talking about? They're like 1.5 feet wide with these long tassels. There must have been, I can't imagine moms on Sunday mornings trying to force their boys into those big white or black bows. That must have been quite a thing Sunday after Sunday. And so at Most Pure Heart of Mary, we have begun what is a choir school. We call it the Schola Cantorum. And in 2012, I was privileged to go to the Cathedral Choir of the Madeleine in Salt Lake City. Have any of you ever been to that? It is actually a Catholic cathedral in Salt Lake City, and they have one of only 2 Catholic choir schools in the United States. Well, possibly one of 3. And so children come to the schools for both boys and girls, and it is dedicated to teaching them the art of sacred music. And I spent 6 weeks there in preparation for collecting information for writing my dissertation, and I wrote it about the Cathedral Choir School at the Madeleine. And I'll never forget the very first Sunday I was there. I mean, I've been going through the choir rehearsals all week long, and it is so edifying when just one choir rehearsal, the choir director pulled out Palestrina Super Flumina Babylonis. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept. And so he passes this out, and of course the kids have to take Latin in the school, and he said, so we need a translation of this piece of music, and it was all 6th grade girls. And the girls began to go through and actually give him a translation. He had to help with a few words, but for the most part, they knew what was going on. And then what really struck me, he said, so what's taking place in Israel at this moment that this psalm grows out of? And was I surprised when a girl raised her hand and said, and I kid you not. Well, in 586 BC, the Babylonians entered Israel and carried off the 2 southern tribes of Judah into Babylonian captivity. And geez, this is not the Catholic education I had growing up. I didn't know there were. Anyway, but what was beautiful, the very first Sunday I was there happened to be, I think it's in the Novus Ordo, I think it's the 26th Sunday of Ordinary Time, where that is the offertory antiphon. So that was the very first Sunday I was there, was the 26th Sunday in Ordinary Time. And if you've ever go to the Madeleine Cathedral, it is literally heaven etched and painted into stone and glass and wood. Every inch of the cathedral is just bursting forth with the saints and the angels. It's just truly beautiful. And I was up in the choir loft, and when they sing, they process in with the procession, and they sing from the apse of the cathedral, sort of in the old Roman style, I guess you'd say. And so the organist was improvising before Mass, and he came to close on a chord, lifted his hand and set it back down on a soft minor chord, and immediately 25 boys intoned the introit for that Sunday. And it rolled through this cathedral like you wouldn't believe. And I mean, I know what music should be like on Sunday, but very rarely do I get it. When we don't go on vacation, I tell my wife, I'm just expecting the worst, and I'm usually served the worst, although there have been some really fine exceptions to that. But it touched me in a way that I can't begin to fathom. And to be honest, I saw the words at that point, the translation. I couldn't even tell you what one of those words is now. But I can tell you that as an experience, that imprinted in me the glory of God and also the beauty of what's taking place sacramentally at Mass. And then from there, to make matters even better, after they had gone through the antiphon and the Gloria Patri, the bell rang and everyone stood, and as they went through the antiphon the second time, it's a glorious sight to behold 25 boys, all in the junior high, walking in procession down the cathedral. Nobody's conducting them, and they're singing the introit. Blown away. And then from there they went into the Kyrie and the Gloria from Vidor's Mass for double choir and organs. You have not heard heaven on earth until you have heard that Mass. And then later I was treated to Palestrinus Super Fluminat Babylonis, and I thought, what an education for these young people, because this music, not only are they getting a good aesthetic education, it's also training their hearts to love what is good, okay? Sometimes in our Catholic faith, it's right that we put an emphasis on there is truth and we follow that no matter what we think, however we feel. You know, when I get up in the morning, I might not feel like always loving my wife and children, but that doesn't matter. It's my duty and I have to, and that's good. But in reality, it's even better if I have been trained, and through my actions, my habitual actions, that I have trained myself to love my wife and children, so that when I get up, it's not my wife and children, it's this is going to be a beautiful day, and I once again have a chance to serve my wife and children this day. So we also want to train the affect along with the intellect. So that's kind of what I'm going to be talking about this morning. Now, a year ago, I addressed many of the church musicians up in the Archdiocese of Detroit, and they asked me to speak on this maxim, and it goes, while it is true that children are able to make beautiful music, it is more significant that music is able to make beautiful children. I'm going to repeat that. While it is true that children are able to make beautiful music, it is more significant that music is able to make beautiful children. Now, being English on my father's side, my first thoughts when I heard this were ones of irony and sarcasm. Recalling the words of an anonymous 20th century English poet, which encapsulated much of my anguish that I sometimes feel when I work with children, I'd like to share that poem with you right now. The choir master stood at the pearly gates, his face was worn and old. He stood before the man of fate for admission to the fold. What have you done, St. Peter said, to gain admission here? I've been a choir master, sir, for many and many a year. The pearly gates flew open wide, St. Peter touched the bell. Come in, he said, and choose your harp. You've had your share of hell. Now, to be honest, I have no qualms in telling you that some of my choristers, especially the boys, I love the boys, I absolutely love it, but the girls come into choir and they're like, oh, Dr. Tappan, what can we do to please you today? The boys come into choir and it's like, oh, this is going to be fun. And I have to tell you, I would happily slip a noose around the necks of some of my best choristers and gleefully pull the lever. But for some reason that I cannot explain, these 10 to 12 hours that I spend working with children every week really are some of the happiest and joyful moments that I spend every week. And I'd like to tell you a little bit of a story why. 2 years ago in October, my family and I attended the funeral of a good friend who succumbed to cancer at the age of 54. She was the receptionist at the Catholic Campus Center at the University of Kansas, the St. Lawrence Center. She was also a lay member of the Society of Our Lady of the Most Holy Trinity, and really one of the most joyful Christians you could ever hope to meet. Unmarried and without children of her own, she was nevertheless a mother to untold numbers of students who walk through the doors of the Catholic Campus Center. Daily Mass, half an hour of meditation, spiritual direction were all part of her daily spiritual life. She had a very orthodox faith, but also a very lively faith. And I heard later, I'm a good friend with her cousin who happens to be a priest in our archdiocese. And he described to me her death, and as she lay dying there, in her hand she held a crucifix that a number of her several of their family members have all died of cancer. And she was holding onto this crucifix, and he said on one arm her mother was holding her, and he said I was on the other side holding the other arm, reciting the prayers for the dying. She had received the apostolic pardon and everything, and he said she quietly, after months and months of offering up the suffering, quietly slipped into eternity. Now, one of the most beautiful things after the funeral mass, and of course, it was just packed, we were standing around at the cemetery afterwards, and so many of us hadn't seen each other in a long time. And we started talking. I think the grave attendants or grave diggers just wanted to get on with things, so they started lowering the coffin down into the ground, even though we were still standing there, which, when you die, please do that so your children can see that. I think that they should. But the beautiful thing came, as they started to do this, I mean, people naturally want to show a respect for the dead, so everybody sort of stopped talking and someone began to sing a hymn. And for the next 20 minutes, I mean, people just began singing. And this was young, old people who I know go to church on a daily basis, and there were some people who looked like they hadn't been to church ever, you know. It was sort of a menagerie of people. And at one point, her brother, who was also unmarried, he and she were very close, he was taking it pretty hard, and he grabbed a handful of dirt and he threw it into the grave, and he took some of his nieces and nephews and they did the same, and pretty soon all the parents started doing that with their children. And you know, it was a very serious and solemn moment, but at the same time there was also a joy, because we knew that, you know, while we still need to pray for Nancy, I mean, chances are we know where she's going. And you know, at the same time, some of the children, when they heard the thud of the dirt on the coffin, you know, they were chuckling and laughing, and it was just a beautiful time. And eventually, the coffin had been long down in the grave, and there was a sister there who intoned the Salve Regina, and we all sang that, and then we left. Well, on the way back to the car, our oldest son, who was 4 years old at the time, he asked, "Daddy, why did we throw dirt into the hole?" And I said, "You know, do you remember a few months ago when we were at Mass and the priest put the black dirt on your forehead in the sign of the cross and said, 'Remember, man, thou art dust, and to dust thou shalt return'?" And he said, "Yeah, I remember that." You know, I explained that man was created by God from the earth, and that when we die, our body is placed back into the earth from which we came, and then our soul, God willing, goes to heaven, and we await the second coming, when our bodies will be reunited with our souls. And, you know, for some reason, children, we often don't give them credit. They often ask very deep questions. And one thing my wife and I always try to do is, when those deep questions come, we don't put it off for a later time. We really try and take hold of that right then and there. And, you know, this is a teachable moment. And one of the things I think we often fail to do in our catechesis, we teach doctrines of the faith, but we don't teach how they relate to our end goal. You know, when we know really solidly what it is, the end goal, and how beautiful a prize that is, it makes the struggle much more worthwhile and much more important too. And so in trying to explain the glory of heaven to my son, I happen to have, well, I always keep a copy of Handel's Messiah in my car. It's my go-to piece that if I'm driving anywhere, that's what I stick in. And I put in 3 pieces. First, we listen to "The trumpet shall sound." And so I was explaining how the trumpet will sound and the dead shall be raised incorruptible. And then the last 2 movements of Handel's Messiah, I swear when I enter heaven, this is what I will hear. "Worthy is the Lamb," and that final amen fugue, that forever, it will be an eternal amen to the glory of the Father in Christ with the Holy Spirit. Just beautiful what we are called to in heaven. And I'm playing this for our children. And you know, for months afterward, we would get in, and the way the trumpet shall sound begins, it dun 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 dun, and it does sort of sound. Our kids started calling it the horsey song. You know, it has that cadence to it. "Daddy, play the horsey song. Play the horsey song." And already we're beginning to form how they view heaven. Okay, which is much different than letting the world form how they view heaven. Because if you end up thinking heaven is going to be sitting on a cloud with a harp, you might not want to go to heaven. I mean, I'm just being honest, and that's something we really struggle with. So, this is why I love working with the young people, is because I really love good Christian music, first of all. But I also like the work of Christian formation, and I really feel that in music, that is what I am doing so much, is forming these young people. Now, what I describe is the formation of the moral imagination. Now, what is the moral imagination? When I talk about the moral imagination, I'm basically referring to, it's sort of the wardrobe of a child's imagination. It's a combination of the ideals, the principles, the meanings, the experiences of one's life, that ultimately orient one to desire with the affect what is good and true. But it also orients one to hopefully hate what is bad and evil. Now, earlier this week, I was having a conversation with a good friend of mine. He is 37 and still trying to find a wife to marry, and he was lamenting the fact that there just don't seem to be a whole lot of good Christian women. So if any of you have daughters around that age, please let me know. I hope he doesn't listen to this. But one of our conversations that we often talk about is, what does it mean to truly be a man? And the conversation, we were talking about that, but then also what does it mean to be a Christian woman? And he said something to me that I think is very true for some people. He said, I'll be honest, we often talk about modesty and how we need to do that so that we are not led astray. And he said, I understand, for some people that really, when you see someone immodestly dressed, that is a pull toward that. But he said, to be honest, when I see that, I'm almost repulsed. He said, what really, what I find so beautiful in a woman is someone who is virtuous and intelligent, beautiful. It's sort of the whole package, not just one thing. Now, I realize that, we obviously modesty and different people in different places. We don't want to put ourselves in occasions of sin. But what he has done through years of prayer and also just how he grew up and things like that, he has come to the point where not only does he know what the good is, but he also desires it with the affect. And it's interesting, I just read this a couple of weeks ago. This is Plato talking about what a moral education is. And he says, hence we ought to have been brought up in a particular way from our very youth. Or no, sorry, this is Aristotle commenting on Plato. Hence we ought to have been brought up in a particular way from our very youth, as Plato says, so as both to delight in and to be pained by the things that we ought, for this is the right education. And so, talking about the moral imagination, that's what I want to talk about today, is how does music help us to train our passions, our emotions, to desire what we know to be good and to be repulsed by what we know to be bad. Now, an example of this, you might take two young men. Let's say one young man is my friend, and another young man, and I have unfortunately known young men like this, who grew up with a father it was a father who was always around and was always doing things with his son, but was generally doing things that they shouldn't have. Fathers who, it might start out, the father's watching, well, all the father does is watch TV, and he has his son with him. That's how they spend time together. And at first, he thinks, okay, well, the son can't see too much stuff bad, but, most of what's on anymore that's G-rated is still, risque. And it starts out with that, but by the time the boys get into high school, father and son might even unfortunately be watching pornography together, or going places they shouldn't, or just spending their time in unwholesome activities. Now, let's say at the age of 20, you have my friend who makes a conscious decision that, the way I've been brought up is right, and I really want to follow this and be the best. And let's take the other young man. Let's say he reaches 20 and realizes the way that he has been brought up is not healthy, and he wants to change. Both of them know the good, but which one is going to have an easier time implementing the good? Okay, so that's why it's so important to form that moral imagination, because I have a lot of good male friends, thanks be to God, and one of them, he and I were having breakfast a few weeks ago, and he said he can remember growing up. He grew up in a household where his father was always around, but his father unfortunately did not provide the right kind of influence. And he said, I can remember sitting in the car with my father as my father told two of my older brothers how he would go about robbing a certain store, and was giving them pointers on how they could do it. And they went and they did it. He said, this is what happened in our home. And he said, what's funny? My dad is now dead. And he said, I still wish that he were here. I love my father. But at the same time, there's this part of me that, why couldn't my father have taught me the right way to go. And thanks be to God for him. He met a wonderful woman who has really helped him to be truly a good Christian man. And so, we want to provide that moral education for our children. Now, how can music affect this? I want to try a little experiment with this so you see how it works. We're going to hum a few different national anthems that I think you might know. First of all, what's the English national anthem? God Save the Queen. Okay, don't worry about the words, but just hum it. Dun 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 da dun dun da 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 da. Good. Do any of you have an emotional or visceral reaction to that song? No, we know what it is. Okay. What about the French national anthem, the Marseillaise? Do you know? Dun 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 dun. Does that give anyone a certain reaction? Let's try the German national anthem. Deutschland über alles. Dun da dun dun da 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 dun dun da 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 dun dun. Did you know that many of you know that melody? Because we actually sing it in church, or at least we do sometimes, to the hymn, Praise the Lord, ye heavens adore him. It was written by Joseph Haydn. It's the Kaisershymne. And again, do any of you have any sort of emotional reaction to it? Now, I do know some people who do have an emotional reaction to it. As a matter of fact, one of my professors in college was also a musician, and he paid his way through graduate school by playing the organ for masses in parishes around Chicago. And it was a Saturday evening mass he was playing, and he happened to choose the hymn, Praise the Lord, ye heavens adore him, for the closing hymn. And so, great big organ, rousing rendition of Praise the Lord, ye heavens adore him, da da dum 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 da dum dum. He said, I got down from the choir loft, and there were about half a dozen old Polish people standing there. And he said they were very kind to me, and realized that I didn't know what was going on, but they had survived the Nazi concentration camps, and that had been played over the loudspeaker system every single day as their family members had been murdered and they were dehumanized in a way that we couldn't even begin to imagine. And he said that they very courteously asked that I please never ever play that hymn in that parish again, okay? And so we see how all of a sudden a song has been emotionally attached. Now, take our national anthem for a second. When we sing let's sing our national anthem. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming? Okay, I saw people out here beginning to close their eyes in a way that they didn't for other things. What are some of the ideas and thoughts that are brought to us when we sing our national anthem?
Bravery.
Bravery. Any other things? I said a few that I think of. I think of bravery. I think of freedom. I think of what kind of freedom was our nation founded upon. I think of the many men and women who have fought for our nation. I think of the many men and women who have died to uphold that freedom. I think of the many 4th of July parades I've been to. I think of the food that our family has shared. I think of what our founding fathers gave up to be able to create this nation. And all of a sudden that hymn takes on a deep, deep meaning. I remember an aunt and an uncle of mine, their son was fighting in Afghanistan, and a number of his friends were killed in active duty. And I remember one 4th of July while their son was over in Afghanistan, and how they celebrated the 4th of July. I mean, it wasn't just, oh, let's get together for a picnic and shoot off fireworks. I was amazed at how that changed how they viewed the 4th of July. And I think if anybody had driven by their house at that time burning the flag or something like that, we would have had a murder right there in front of the house, because that meant so much to them because of how they were attached. Now, so far we've only talked about how can music be associated with things good or bad, but there's also a flip side to this, that the music then comes back and affects how we view whatever it is we're singing about. in a way, the moral imagination is sort of like food. You know, we feed our bodies, and if we feed our bodies good food, our bodies end up craving that good food. But then they're also loving that food then helps us to choose those certain foods in the future. Now, let's think about this within the liturgy for a second. A couple of years ago, I was at St. Thomas on Fifth Avenue in New York, which is an Anglican church, but they have the greatest men and boys choir in the United States, and there was a music conference going on there. And the director that year was a man named Barry Rose. He's in his 80s. He directed the music at St. Paul's Cathedral in London for years. And an amazing musician, and as he was talking to the students, you know, in the Anglican liturgy, they, well, I mean, without the Eucharist, their daily communion service really loses everything. And so what they really focus on musically becomes choral evensong. And the backbone of choral evensong is the Psalter. And the boys in these choir schools, literally day in and day out, they're singing the Psalter. They usually use the Coverdale translation. And after about 4 or 5 years of doing this, they have large portions of the Psalter memorized. And so Barry Rose was talking to the boys, and he said, young men, you know, I am in my 80s, and I am looking death straight in the face right now. And I can tell you that when you get to my age, as you begin to contemplate death more and more, what you're going to think about is not going to be the songs that you hear on the radio. It's not going to be, you know, movies that you've seen. He said, your mind is going to go back time and time again to the words that you have sung day after day in this church, and you will be contemplating heaven based on these words. And that is so true. The music and the words that we give our children form how they are going to view heaven, how they view Christ, their faith, everything. And so, just like food, we need to make sure that we are giving our children the best of what it is to contemplate. Now, this can also lead to some funny situations, like Barry Rose said one evening, when he was directing the music at Guildford Cathedral, he said, the psalm that evening, is it Psalm 72 where they talk about the destruction of the temple with the hatchet and the pickaxe? Is it Psalm 72? Okay. And he said that was the psalm for that evening, and as we walked into the choir stalls, there were these wooden doors on the choir stalls, and one of them just would not open, and so we had a traffic jam there in the aisle as the boys are trying to get in. So one of the men of the choir came up and tried to fix it, and it just wasn't going, and finally he thought, well, I'll use brute force, and literally ripped the door right off of the choir stall. And he said, you know, in the future it was very hard to sing Psalm 72 without remembering the literal destruction of our temple. So with the Psalter and with other music, how does this affect our children? I'd like to use 2 examples here. One is going to be a praise and worship song, and then the other one will be a hymn that most of us probably know. How many of you have heard the praise and worship song, Yes, Lord, yes, Lord, yes, yes, Lord? Okay. Do you all know the words? There are 2 of them. Yes, Lord, yes, Lord, yes, yes, Lord. Yes, Lord, yes, Lord, yes, yes, Lord. And then you raise your hand in the sign of an L, and yes, Lord, yes, yes, Lord. This goes, I mean, truly Shakespeare had to have written that. And, you know, when I hear this, I don't know if I can't say that there isn't a teeny place for that somewhere. I don't know. I want to say that. But what precisely is that teaching our young people? Now, I know what yes means, and I have some concept of what Lord means. I hope to spend all of eternity thinking about that more. But what does that really mean? Now, let's take the tantum ergo, for example. If I asked you to tell me a literal translation of every word in the tantum ergo, how many of you would be able to do that right now? Probably only a few, okay? However, would most of you say that you know a general translation of what it's talking about, the tantum ergo? Okay, where do we use the tantum ergo? Benediction, and on Holy Thursday. We use it a lot, okay? And so in there, even though I couldn't give a literal translation of every word, I know the general gist of what's going on. Now, because it's always been associated with benediction, it's a time of adoration before the Lord. It's a time of contemplating this great mystery of the Holy Eucharist. Thanks be to God in our church, whenever we have benediction, it's always celebrated very reverently and with great love. And so this forms me. But at the same time, in the final stanza, I'd have to sing through to think of the Latin, but in the English, in our true native land to be. And I think our native land, our native home. And I often think about that is what heaven is. That's that place where we will one day be with God and with our, God willing, with all of our family members and friends, with the church from the entire, from all the ages. And just the sound of that song brings up certain emotions about that love for heaven. But then also the words of heaven change how I view heaven. Because now I see it as this fatherland, because there is a heavenly Father. And in a father, thanks be to God, I had a very wonderful father, so it's easier for me to relate to that image. And then, patria, the land that comes from that word father, the fatherland, to be with the Father, that again changes how I view heaven. So, which is really forming young people more? Yes, Lord, yes, Lord, yes, yes, Lord, yes, Lord, yes, Lord, yes, 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 yes. Or, down in adoration falling, lo, the sacred host we hail, or ancient rites fallen. See, I'd have to sing it. Again, music is very important because then it helps me to memorize the words. You see, that's what happens when I don't write these things down. And so, and that is something true. I today could tell you right now the 50 states in the United States in alphabetical order if I sing them. If I didn't sing them, I couldn't do that for you. And music helps us. Now, when we look at the music of the church, Gregorian chant specifically, I'm struck by the fact that the church, through years, centuries upon centuries of just spending time in prayer with the texts of the liturgy, came up with this music that fits so well. It's something that could only happen organically. Good art never comes out of a committee. That's I despise committees. And when committees get together and, well, how can we do this to make something more beautiful? I think, oh, yikes, put on the seatbelts, here we go again. We've been through this for the last 50 years. No more, please stop. But Gregorian chant over the centuries, and this tension between the liturgical text and prayer and singing, we come up with this music. And just a few things about it that strike me with the why I think it's so beautiful. Let's just, music is made up of pitch, rhythm, and text generally, and some nature, at least choral vocal music is. So, let's look at rhythm. In most songs that we sing, there's a definite 1, 2, 3, 4. It's predictable, even it's why even when we sing the Tantum Ergo to the Tantum Ergo Sacramentum, that's nice, but Tantum Ergo Sacramentum is so much better, and I'll tell you why. Because in the Tantum Ergo Sacramentum, it's in 4/4. Every single measure is predictable. It's the same over and over and over. There's no variety. But yet in the Tantum Ergo chant, it's always this tension, this push and pull between groups of 3, groups of 2. We never quite, it's predictable in one sense, because we know it's always going to be groups of 3 and 2, but yet it's not predictable because we don't know how they're going to be grouped. In a sense, because God is who he is, and he is unchanging, he is predictable, I guess one could say. I'm not a theologian. If I say anything that's heretical, just stand up and I'll stop. But at the same time, how many of us, when you think about it, we even talk, it's almost cliche about, you just never know what God has in mind. And, we can't contain him in a box. We can't put his mind in a box and say, yep, we know what God's going to do next. We know what he's going to permit or allow or do. We just don't. And that music, the chant, and polyphony to an extent, does that same thing. It shows us the great unity of God, but also the great variety. That sounds wrong, but you sort of get the gist. I think about pitch, the same thing. With the tantum ergo, it's in the major key, and without getting too technical, major usually sounds happy, minor usually sounds sad, and it's, again, very predictable. It's happy over and over and over. And, too much happiness without true joy is sometimes a burden. And whereas you think about the chant, being in a certain mode, there are times when there's a joy that's brought out, there's a time when a sadness is brought out. Again, it's predictable because we know it's going to be one of those 8 church modes, but at the same time, it's not predictable because how is it going to be put together? And even though things are in a mode, doesn't mean they always stay. It's not bound and fast. Again, it's that sort of tension between the fact that God is unchanging, but yet just because he's unchanging, he is not predictable. And I mean, to be honest, I have never in my life turned on the radio just to listen to pop music. And I am weird in that sense. Even as a kid, I don't know. My parents probably thought I was weird. I just had this uncanny sense for, I just don't like that. But at the same time, it took me a while to get to the point where chant had this deep-seated effect on me, and it takes an education, but the more I learned about my faith, and then also I saw how the music speaks so beautifully to that faith, the two have grown up together in a sense. Another example of how this affects, how certain music affects how we see things, I want to talk, I hate to put a damper on things, we're going to talk about death for a minute. Really all of life comes down to one thing. It doesn't matter too much what you do as long as you die well. Well, one thing that I always struggled with growing up was seeing heaven as something other than sitting on a cloud playing a harp. And so, thanks be to God, I grew up in a strong Catholic family, and I knew that I didn't want the alternative, but at the same time, it was one of those, God, yeah, I want heaven because the alternative is not good, but if we could just push it off as long as possible, because I really enjoy it down here. It's true, we have our vicissitudes, but at the same time, I'm really happy, and I hate sitting all day, and I just can't do that for all eternity. Well, thanks be to God, that sort of changed over a while. My wife and I had never read the Chronicles of Narnia until we were married, and the first movie came out, and I thought, well, we should probably read the book and not just go see the movie. And someone gave us the whole set, and we were reading through, and we finally got to the last battle, the 7th book in the Chronicles of Narnia, and began to describe what I will call the new and eternal Narnia. And this idea of further up and further in, and the great, it's really describing the heaven of Narnia, I guess. And the deeper they went into it, the more real it became. In a sense, it was still Narnia, but it was the real Narnia. The food, the colors of the fruits were deeper and more real. The colors of the leaves were more real. The land was greener. The sky was bluer. The taste of the fruit was infinitely more delicious. There was Aslan, the Christ figure in the book, who, he was the center of everything, but yet all good human relationships were still there too. And, this good relationship that I had with my father is still there, but my relationship with him on earth... Taken care of.
Father Floyd.
Oh, it was a priest who did that. Oh my gosh, we're going to have a word with him. I have a cousin who always calls at the wrong time, and I always keep my cell phone off all the time because I'm in church, every day playing for Mass and stuff like that. And one time I didn't have it off, and dang if it wasn't at a wedding, and the homily had just been given, that silence. And so in the Novus Ordo, the vows take place right after the homily. And it was the silence between the homily and the wedding vows. And the organist down front. Shouldn't happen, but it was. And my cell phone was at the organ, and I was sitting in the pew with my wife. And sure enough, that cousin called. I could have murdered him. I know nothing about technology. The cell phone was still in the same ringtone it had when I bought it. And all of a sudden, it started doing something like, remember that old Motorola flip phone thing? Motorola, dun, 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 whatever was going on. And it started going off. I was mortified, and my wife began to jump up to get it, and I held her down. I said, don't. Right now, nobody knows where that sound is coming from. You jump up there, they're all going to know it's us. Just keep quiet and sit on your hands. And we did, and nobody knew it was us. Now I've completely... Oh, back to that. So, church music is a blast when you get down to it, you know? So eternity. Why? After I read that 7th book, I immediately ran to our local Catholic bookstore, and the man who owns it, he's a member of the fraternity parish up in Kansas City, and he meticulously combs through everything he puts on his shelves. And I said, "Do you have any books about heaven?" I was so excited. Is this really what heaven is? Because if it is, my whole life has been changed. And he said, I have 2 really good books about heaven by Peter Kreeft. And I opened them up, and of course, lots of St. Thomas Aquinas, but also, there he is quoting C.S. Lewis in The Last Battle. I'm like, score, we're good, okay? Well, around the same time, actually it was shortly before this, during my last year in college, I had just gotten home on spring break, and like I said, we were blessed to have the father that everybody on the street wished was his own father. And my dad was so happy to have all of us home. And, well, we weren't all home. The sister right under me is actually a nun, and she was in her postulant year, but their mother house was only 5 minutes from where we lived, so she was close by. And the Sunday night that we got home, we were having supper, and we were having supper with a friend of ours. And my dad was only 55 at the time, and totally out of the blue, after supper, as we were sitting there, he quietly slipped into eternity from a heart attack at the age of 55. And of course, he was rushed to the hospital, and there was nothing they could do. And afterwards, they brought us into the room where he lay. And the first thing we did, I had gone to the convent and gotten my sister, so we were all there as a family. And we prayed the rosary. But after that, are any of you familiar with Victoria, Kansas? The only basilica in the state of Kansas? Okay, my mom is from Victoria, and so I grew up with this, not that I grew up speaking German, but when I was a kid, most of the older members of the family still spoke with, sounded like they had just gotten off the boat, even though they had lived there all their lives, and they sang. I mean, these people sang all the time. As a kid, I remember after about 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 hours of this singing, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so boring. But then one day in the 8th grade, I thought, nobody else does this. This is kind of cool. And we started, we got to the point where even in our own family, we get together and we sing. So after we had finished the rosary, what did we do? We're standing in the hospital and we start singing. And there's a song in Victoria that, for centuries has been sung at funerals after the funeral liturgy at the gravesite is finished. And as they're lowering I guess it'd be after they lower the body into the grave, they sing this song. In German, it's called the Grablied, and it starts out, Vollendet hienieden ist nun mein Lauf, jetzt nimm mich, o Vater, zu dir hinauf, which roughly means, my life is ended, my course my life has run its course, Father, bend down and take me unto you. And so that was the first song that we started to sing. And the last verse, it ends, Einst werden in lichtem Himmelshöhen für alle verklärt uns ja Wiedersehen, which, if you know the word Wiedersehen, you often hear Auf Wiedersehen, which is the way they say goodbye, but it technically means until we meet again. And so there we were, and I had heard this sung many times. As a matter of fact, when our family gets together, it's often the last song that we sing before everybody departs. And at that point, every Sunday of my life, I have prayed that I believe in the communion of saints and life everlasting. But in that moment, it was brought home to me that I was being forced to trust. Well, not forced, but I could either choose to trust in that at that moment, that there would be a Wiedersehen, or else I could take the way of many young people today and say, oh, that's it. I'll never see him again, and life is cruel. But throughout this hymn, it speaks of the great mercy of God and the fact that we will see each other again. And we sang that as after his body was lowered into the grave. We sang that at the cemetery. And then in one of the, within the next few years, it seemed like everybody in my life just bit the dust. All the grandparents went, aunts and all. I mean, it was just like the Grim Reaper made a swath over our family, like you wouldn't believe. And after those 5 years of singing this song almost yearly at the cemetery for people I had dearly known and loved, it has really changed how I view heaven. And that, along with Handel's Messiah that we talked about before, again, has shaped how I view heaven. And now when I see heaven, I mean, it is this place where I would give my limbs to go to and get to if I have to. I want it that badly. And I told Father once, I said, we're always, well, maybe I shouldn't tell Father how to preach, but I said, it's great. I know in the last 50 years we've had poor catechesis. Heaven knows we've had it. But if all we ever do is talk about the doctrines of the faith without attaching them to our final destiny, it's sort of like teaching people how to play the game of football, but you never talk about actually winning. Nobody knows what winning is. We just know how to play the game. After a while, people get bored with it. Music helped me to know what heaven is so that I can desire it and want it. And it makes it easier to, when you're battling sin and all those things, like I know I should, I don't want to, but I often begin in times of trial and tribulation, I will often sing to help bring back those memories, that consciousness, to help me to love the good so that I can choose it easier. Now think about the difference of this between that and the song like In the Garden or And He Walks With Me and He Talks With Me. I hear those at Catholic funerals too, unfortunately, and I think we have cheapened heaven. But yet with the text of the church and the music of the church, it brings this glorious reality to life. The music does. Now, okay, so this is a symposium on hopefully practical things as well. What does this mean for us? Some of you are older, some of you are younger with children. I work a lot with children, so this is geared toward children, but I think it's, even though the moral imaginations of adults have largely been formed, I think we can also continue to shape them at this age. How can we use music to help our children to desire the good? First of all, I think about young boys and how there's really a struggle with how to teach young men or young boys to become good Christian men. And two things that boys tend to gravitate toward today: video games and sports. And if you look at video games, what are the ones that they so often like? It's the shooting ones where they're at war and they're fighting for something, okay? And if you look at sports, it's a very physical activity where they are, again, fighting for something, a prize. Now, unfortunately, in the video games, that fighting for something is not necessarily fighting for something good. It's just sort of random killing and blood and guts flying everywhere on the screen. And I always thank God that I was so bad at video games, I just never got stuck on it. They frustrated the living daylights out of me. And when I think of sports, I think sports are very good in the sense that they do teach good habits and virtues and things like that. But again, when we think about the prize of sports, a trophy, it's not a very, very lasting thing. So how can music help to spur our young boys on? What are some things that they would like? First of all, many of our folk hymns talk about things that are truly good and holy. I think about, that song, Biled and Cabbage Down? Maybe not. You're all looking at me like you have no clue. How many of you have ever watched Andy Griffith? Okay, when the Darlings come down out of the mountains and they start doing their music? Oh my gosh, I could listen to that all day long. Oh, I thought she was laughing. So, when the Darlings come down out of the Tennessee mountains and they start singing, it's like, hit rewind, let's just listen to this, forget the rest of the movie. And so one of the songs Andy Griffith would sing is Biled and Cabbage Down, and one of the verses goes, love her in the summer, love her in the fall. If I can't have my own true love, I won't have none at all. And I think what a wholesome picture of true love, a very innocent way that these folk songs would convey to young people about what love is. Then I also think of the folk song, Hang Down Your Head, Tom Dooley. Anybody heard of that one? Okay, I once got into so much trouble for teaching that in a Catholic school. I thought I was going to have my head ripped off. And of course, our principal was a woman who thought that it was terrible. You know, in the song, it talks about this person is hanged because he murdered his girlfriend. And I'm stuck between trying to give a catechesis lesson to my own principal on, well, technically, the death penalty is a moral judgment. It's not intrinsically evil here. And, it's hard to start giving your superior a theology lesson. It was really between a rock and a hard place. And then I also wanted to say, from the way your son talks, I think he plays the video game Grand Theft Auto, which if you know anything about Grand Theft Auto, you gain points for stealing other people's cars and doing other things. And at the end of the day, I just can't see how what I'm doing is anything worse than what you're allowing in your own home. Anyway, it teaches something to young children, that there is a consequence to one's actions, I think of some other songs that I know. There's one, I can't think of how it begins, but it's I think we call it the cannonball song. You can't run a race with a cannon. It's this guy, it's a sailor who he has lost both of his legs in war, and the gist is you can't run a race with a cannonball. Anybody know that song? I see someone back. What's that? You've heard of it? Okay. Now in there, every song can't be, shoving morality down the throat. You've just got to have some good, clean fun. And it's a song about a guy who is in war and he lost both of his legs, but you know what? He's still able to have fun with it. Okay, so at least we're teaching something about being able to accept suffering and laugh at ourselves. You can't get through life without laughing. And so families, you really need to just shut off the TV and sing. I mean, when it gets down to it, I know as a kid, I thought, how boring. These people, all they do is stand around and sing. But I am so glad I was a part of that. And now, there is so much joy to just be standing around and singing, harmonizing. It's a great way to be together, to build community. If nothing else, even if you're singing about stupid things, you're still coming closer to those people you should be knowing and loving. Okay? Now, let's begin to... So these songs can teach our boys about adventure, about taking risks, about doing great things in life. It's developing those powers within them to desire greatness, which we just don't desire of our young boys anymore. Now, take this into church, and with children, I think about some hymns that maybe you as families can take back with you. Gregorian chant, much of the repertoire is, I've heard a lot of people say, well, anybody can sing Gregorian chant. Some of the pieces, yes, they can. But the vast majority of it, I just don't think most families are cut out to be singing the graduals of the Mass for evening devotions. It's beyond. But what are some things that we can really take with us? I think of the simple versions of the Four Marian antiphons. That is a great place to start with your children, especially you think of the Salve Regina. Most of them probably know the prayer in English as well, the Hail Holy Queen. That's one thing that our children have really latched onto. They like that song, and it's funny, they don't yet know what every word means, but already they know that it is this song about Mary. And as they learn what the words mean, that again will begin to shape how they view Mary and their relationship with her. So those songs, I think about the Veni Creator. There was never a more beautiful and perfect hymn that was composed than the Veni Creator. I have a sister who loves that song, and we'll be walking down the street singing the Veni Creator. It's a weird but wonderful family. I think about good hymns, O Sacred Head Surrounded. Good grief, that has to be one of the most beautiful four-part hymns in the repertoire of Christianity. That and Lo, how rose ere blooming. When half spent was the night, this rod of Jesse, this flower blossomed forth. Just beautiful. It sort of counteracts this idea that Christmas is just about Santa Claus and tinsel. I think about Advent and the the Veni Emmanuel, and that being based on the great O antiphons, and just that rejoice Israel, this expectation. We've lost Advent completely, and Advent is so beautiful, but how could we once again bring that to our families, the Veni Emmanuel? Now, I'm probably way over time. Like my dad, I could talk the ears off of 15 stone statues. However, to close, so our choir school that we have at Most Pure Heart, not that we're able to sing everything that I would like to, there's always a process of building up, but in reality, it is, I would put it as one of the top 5 Catholic children's choirs in the United States. They are that good. I mean, when you listen to them, you don't know that they're children until you see the fact. I mean, I've had visitors to the parish say that. First of all, their thing is, oh my gosh, where do you get a choir like that in Topeka, Kansas? And then they go down to communion, and it's like, those are children, holy cow. And so far from the choir, we have had 2 young men who have entered the priesthood, and another young woman who has decided to go into sacred music for her life's, you might call it, avocation, I guess. And I can't take credit for these 2 boys going off to the priesthood. They both come from wonderful families. However, both have said that by being in the choir, the way they view the Mass, I mean, they intellectually knew what the Mass was before. Like I said, they came from good families. But in terms of having a much more intimate relationship and truly desiring this Mass, that has been shaped by the music that we have sung. It's been shaped by, I love every year on Good Friday is one of the most beautiful days. We sing the Victoria Improperia, and then we actually use an English version of the reproaches after that. And some of you might cringe, but you have to do it. It's better than most parishes, it's a process, right? And but we do that, and then we go into the Crux Fidelis. Oh my gosh, you could sit there and contemplate the words of that hymn all day long. Here is Mary standing at the foot of the cross. And in there, her mind is going back to this child who's lying in a manger wrapped in swaddling clothes. What anguish that must have been. And Good Friday is no longer, oh, well, that's just the day that Christ died. Now, because of this, every child in that choir has the line memorized. My people, what have I done to you? How have I grieved you? Answer me. Every one of them knows that. As a matter of fact, when the music comes out, they're like, we know this. Great. We still have the same catechetical lesson every year when it comes out. It's forming how they see the faith. It's so much better than, I could tell you half a dozen songs that I heard growing up on Good Friday, and just every last one of them just leaves so much to be desired. It's like sitting down to lobster thermidor or, hot dogs. I mean, which do you want? And I guess the question at the end of the day is, do we desire greatness for our children? I heard someone say once, or just recently, that one of the greatest problems in our church today is this lack of magnanimity. I can never pronounce this word, but the opposite of magnanimity is it pusillanimity? I always get that. It's a great word, but I can never pronounce it. And we struggle with that. What is the least that we can get by? As long as the collection's big enough to keep the lights on, everybody just plows forward, we're fine. And to break out of that, to once again, with music and many other things, it's not just music, but to show children what it is we're striving for heaven, for greatness, for good families, for good fathers and mothers, for children, that when you educate them that way, when they see what Hollywood produces, it's like some forms of, well, I won't say what food, but some sort of foods leave just bad tastes in your mouth. It's that way. And we want that for our children, so that when they intellectually know the good, they can look deep inside and say, I not only know the good, but I desire it. And I'm going to put that into effect. And when you desire it, it becomes infectious, and you want others to desire it as well. And so let's do that for our children. Thank you very much. Are we supposed to ask if there are any questions or not? I don't know. Are there any? If not, we'll move on to, I'm sure you all want to break.
Oh, I do have one.
Okay.
Do you have a source know of a source for all those folk songs, folk hymns?
I actually do. There's a great website. I I'll have to look it up and give it to you, but there's actually a folk song repository where back in the 1920s and 30s, it was a popular thing to go around collecting folk songs because people knew it wouldn't be long before they would be extinct. And they actually recorded a lot of folk songs, especially in Kentucky, the Appalachians and things like that. And so they have both the music, but also recordings of people from that time singing them. And it's really neat. Yeah. So, all right. Thank you very much.
Oh, sir,
Yes.
can you sing the Autumn Ergo for us? Would you do that?
The chant.
Yeah.
Could we all sing it together? Those who know the Tantum Ergo. Okay. Well. We'll start there, buddy, and Tantum Ergo Sacramentum Venerem Cerui et Anticum Documentum Noce Tui Prestet Fide Supplementum Sensum Defectui Genitori Genitorque Compassionatio Salus honor virtus quoque sit et benedictio procedenti labutroque compassit laudatio